Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Travel Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Emily, and today I am looking forward to talking to you about a place that I've never been to, but a place that I certainly wish to go to, and that is Abu Dhabi. And I decided to pick a place today that I've never been to because I think that learning about places that maybe we are unfamiliar with is very important, and I think that it is a way to really extend our our travel tastes and our travel palette and what we were comfortable with, and moving outside of maybe places that I would normally think about traveling to. And particularly when we're talking about the Middle East, I think a lot of times it can get overlooked due to politics, due to the way that the U.S. kind of views the Middle East in general. And I studied Islam in the Middle East for a while in college, and it's been really on top of my list for a very long time to travel to because of my studies that I've done. And as I said, I'm really looking forward to talking about something that I haven't been able to yet. And in researching this episode, I've discovered a lot of interesting things and things that I'm really looking forward to going to see, hopefully, one day. And so on this episode, I'm going to talk to you top to bottom about Dubai, the UAE, the Middle East, and all that it has to offer. But also, stay tuned for the end of the episode because I think that it's important to talk a little bit about, and that's what I'm going to do, talk a little bit about what is happening in the Middle East right now, because I can't think of anything more important to travel than the political climate in which you're walking into. I want to stay factual and matter of fact and just kind of lay out, what is happening, but I don't think that we can talk about the Middle East without talking about the stigma that a lot of Americans have about the Middle East in general. And it's definitely a sensitive topic, but I think it's important to understand the Middle East, its people, and what's actually going on there. And so I'm going to attempt to kind of iron out some questions and presumptions that, both you and I probably have previous to this episode. And so you'll have to stay tuned to the end of the episode where we get into a little bit of what is happening right now in the Middle East. But first, as always, this is something I do for every single episode. We're going to start with the basics of Abu Dhabi. So Abu Dhabi is in the AUE, the United Arab Emirates, and that's a country in Western Asia, at the northeast end of the Arabian Peninsula, so it's on the Persian Gulf. It borders the countries of Oman to the east and then Saudi Arabia to the south and the west. As we know, Saudi Arabia is quite large, as well as it shares maritime borders with Qatar to the west and then Iran to the north, just to give you a general location layout. The climate in the UAE and in Abu Dhabi is hot, it's humid, it's along the coast, but as you go inland, you are at the desert, and so it is super hot, super dry, in towards the interior of the land. Rainfall averages only 4 to 6 inches annually, which is kind of insane. And then just to give you guys times of years, which I talk about all the time, is always you should really consider the time of year that you want to go. So in January, you're looking at an average of 64 degrees Fahrenheit, and then in July, it could get 91 degrees Fahrenheit, but it can reach even up to 115 degrees Fahrenheit in the summertime. And 120 degrees in the desert, which sounds insane to me, but good to know. Midwinter and early summer, there are known to be very strong winds that bear dust and sand. So just as an update, you can choose which you would prefer to go to. Some people love that heat. So moving on to kind of the population of the UAE, there's a population of about 9.2 million, and then 1.4, and this is as of 2013 data. I'm going to break it down a little bit more recently, but as of 2013, the population was 9.2 billion, and 9.2 million, and 1.4 million of the citizens are originally from the UAE, and then 7.8 million are expats, which I found really interesting, and that was as of 2013, but we will break it down more and understand that it kind of has even grown to a greater degree of expats who have moved to the UAE and especially have moved to Abu Dhabi. So nowadays, only 1/9 of the Emirates residents are actual Emirates citizens. The remainder are mostly foreign workers and their dependents, so their families. A lot in South Asian, which is the largest group of these people. So Arabs from countries other than the UAE and Iranians account for the other significant portion, which makes sense because those are the countries very close to them. Southeast Asian, including Filipinos, have also increasingly immigrated to the UAE, and that is specifically for work. So I have a graph right in front of me, and it is the ethnic composition of the UAE, and we're looking at Indian being the greatest at 38%, and then actual citizens who are from the UAE actually only make up 11.6%, which is really interesting. And other significant ethnic groups include Egyptians, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Filipino, and a few others. So that's something really interesting to consider when you are visiting a country, how many expats and how many other visitors are also going to be there with you. And then, of course, moving on to the religion, as is most places in the Middle East, about 3/5 of the population is Muslim, and that number would probably be higher if it weren't for the high number of, as we mentioned, expats who do come to the UAE and who do come to Abu Dhabi. And then 4/5 of that Muslim population are Sunni, and 1/5 would be Shia, which is unimportant to you unless you are familiar with Islam and Muslims. And so there are a very small but growing number of Christian and Hindus in the country, which again, this kind of has to do with the growing number of immigrants that are happening. And so again, I'm looking at a graph right in front of me, and about 62% of the population is Muslim, about 21% is Hindu, about 9% Christian, 4% Buddhist, and then 4% other, which is just really interesting and important information to know. So, a little bit of a breakdown of the UAE and how we're going to start talking specifically about Abu Dhabi. So the UAE, which stands for the United Arab Emirates, is made up of a federation of 7 emirates along the eastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula. So this is just explaining kind of more, and this is a quote coming right from the Encyclopedia of Britannica, which is just a website that has a lot of interesting and factual information. And so this quote reads, "The Emirates comprise a mixed environment of rocky desert, coastal plains, and wetlands, and waterless mountains. The seashore is a haven for migratory water flow and draws birdwatchers all over the world. The country's unspoiled beaches and opiate resorts also have drawn international travelers. Standing at a historic and geographic crossroads has made up a diverse nationality and ethnic groups. The UAE presents a striking blend of ancient customs and modern technology, of cosmopolitanism and insurgency, and of the wealth and want. The rapid pace of modernization of the Emirates prompted travel writer Jonathan Rabin to note this of the capital. Quote, "The condition of Abu Dhabi was so inevitably mint that it would not have been surprising to see adhering to the building bits of straw and polystyrene from the crates in which they had been packed. And so that kind of moves us right into Abu Dhabi, talking about how the UAE, and then Abu Dhabi in particular, is a increasingly developed and developing, obviously the word developing being considered as what us Americans consider to be developed. But it is a completely developing city. It is rapidly increasing in terms of wealth and money and capital. And it is the capital city of the UAE, and it is one of the 7 emirates, if that makes sense. So, a little bit of background. Abu is Arabic for father, and Dhabi is the Arabic word for gazelle. And so the Abu Dhabi means father of gazelle, and that's actually because, we'll kind of learn this more when we move into our art section, but interestingly enough, before the city existed, there were an abundance of gazelles in the area, which I find really interesting, and so that is actually the original name and where it comes from. So, Abu Dhabi is comprised up of 3/4 of the Federation's total land area, which I find extremely fascinating, and it's the center of the oil industry, which makes it an extremely wealthy city. $1 billion UAE economy, so it's really pulling in literally almost the entire GDP for the country per year, which I find fascinating, but really expected, especially due to the fact that it has a hand in the oil industry. And so basically, because of all of this, the city, is just truly impeccable. I'm gonna tweet some pictures of just the architecture and what it looks like, but I just think it's so beautiful, it's so wonderful. It's very unique to me. And I think it really, you look at a picture and you kind of know exactly what it is, and it does this a great idea of bridging this incredibly old, like, architectural and art culture with this brand new, the brand new one of kind of moving towards this development and moving towards a new modern feel, and so on and so forth. And so we're going to talk more about the architecture and the culture and everything when we come back from the break.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
And we are back from our break. Before the break, I gave you the very basics of the country of the UAE and Abu Dhabi in general. And as promised, for this next little bit, I am going to talk to you about Abu Dhabi's very interesting, very unique architecture. And architecture is, such a massive part of sightseeing and such a massive part of travel. And it's something that to be honest with you, I don't know a lot about architecture, and I really wish I did, because it's really what makes up so much of these views and these sites that we love to see when we travel. And I think that Abu Dhabi really stands out to me in terms of its architecture and in terms of just what it's able to accomplish through its architecture, which is, as I mentioned before the break, this fascinating mix between old and new and modern and ancient. And I think it's very representative of the change that Abu Dhabi is going through. And it is certainly something that attracts many tourists every year, because who doesn't want to go to a beautiful city, if that makes sense. And so I just wanted to mention a few that were particularly interesting to me, and I kind of pulled up pictures for myself so I could look at them while I was explaining them to you. And the very first one is called the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and if you listen to my last episode of Paris, I talked about the Louvre that is in Paris, and something that's really interesting about this building is it's actually was made both by the French president, Emmanuel Macron, and then the UAE vice president, Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, and I'm sorry if I butchered that, but it was made by the French president and then the UAE vice president, and as a mix to kind of interconnect these cultures. And when I look at it, it is essentially right on the water. It's a beautiful location, and the Louvre has this massive dome over the top of it. It looks almost like an umbrella, you could say, and just a very, very detailed roof, a completely curved roof. It is like nothing I've ever seen before, and it definitely catches your eye. But so the museum, and that's what it is. It's an art museum, and it certainly looks like it should be. But the museum is actually part of a 30-year agreement between the city of Abu Dhabi and the French government, which is really interesting. And I think that's an attempt to have a very civil relationship and to build a relationship. And they did it kind of through this beautiful art museum, which is the reason why it's called the Louvre Abu Dhabi. And the building is 260,000 square feet, which is insane. And the final cost of construction was expected to be about 600 million euros, I believe. In addition, a U.S. 525 million was paid by Abu Dhabi to be associated with the Louvre name, so they just paid for the name. And then an additional 747 million is paid in exchange for art loans, special expeditions, exhibitions, and management advice. And so that was about 600 million for the cost of it, and then 525 million plus 747 million from the UAE to the French government for the name of the Louvre, for sharing different art pieces, and then for sharing kind of advice, which is very interesting. And specifically in the museum, it has artworks from all around the world that are showcased at the museum. And then there's this particular focus placed on bridging the gap between Eastern and Western art, which, I mean, is a completely loaded statement. There is so much to be said about that. And there's so much, I think that no art, whether it's Eastern or Western or any art, should be cherished any more or any less. But I think that this is a really interesting way to kind of be able to cherish both of those together. And so if we consider that piece of architecture, which, as I mentioned, is kind of right on the water, it's this massive dome building. It looks very much like an umbrella, very much like a spaceship almost. And if we compare that with the building, it's called essentially the Grand Mosque, and it's the largest mosque in the country. It's a key place of worship. Honestly, daily for every single person. It has Friday and Eid prayers. During Eid, it can be visited by more than 40,000 people, which is absolutely insane. And when you look at it, it looks like something that you would find in the UAE and something you would find in the Middle East. It's completely white. It has so many of those really traditional mosque roofs, which are kind of curved with a pointy top to them. But there's, tens of 20s of them. There's beautiful white marble floors, very traditional, very gorgeous. And this building actually surprised me because it was built between 1996 and 2007. But as we know, the construction and the architecture of mosques is very, very ancient and very old. And so it's actually covering more than 30 acres, which really surprised me in a city. And the project that is this great mosque was launched by the late president of the UAE, who wanted to establish a structure that would unite the cultural diversity of the Islamic world with the historical and modern values of architecture and art today, which again, makes so much sense. And I think kind of that theme going on between bridging the old and the new, bridging traditional and modern together, has really been interwoven into the entire city. And so you have these two absolutely gorgeous, beautiful, you really could call them, pieces of art. Those are woven together with these absolutely massive skyscrapers all throughout the city, and it gives us this overall unique and distinct look. So the reason why there are so many tall buildings and so many skyscrapers is because it was actually encouraged in a plan that Abu Dhabi had. It's called the Abu Dhabi Plan 2030, which essentially is supposed to lead to the construction of a bunch of new skyscrapers over the next decade or so. And particularly, they want to expand the central business district in Abu Dhabi. And so there are many, many new developments going on Al Mara Island and Al Reem Island, which we will talk about later in the episode. But Abu Dhabi already has a number of these super tall skyscrapers that are under construction that have either been finished or are just finishing up right now. And some of the tallest buildings on the skyline include ones that are 1,253 feet, which is the Central Market Residential Tower. There's the Landmark, which is 1,600 feet. There's the Sky Tower, which is 1,017 feet. All of these are completed. All of these are absolutely massive, and they really make up the whole structure of the city, which is really interesting. So a lot of them, as I mentioned, have either been proposed or approved to continue to help transform the city skyline. And as of July 2008, there were 62 high-rise buildings under construction, approved for construction, or proposed for construction, which is really insane. So as we know, that there's this huge expansion going on. And the reason why I say that is because the architecture and the way that Abu Dhabi looks is a massive attraction, and it's something that you absolutely need to see when you do go to Abu Dhabi. And so next up, I'm going to talk to you about where to visit, what to wear, what to eat, and all of that is going to happen after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Travel Podcast. So, before the break, I gave you the basics of Abu Dhabi. We talked about the architecture of Abu Dhabi and how that really makes up so much of the city's culture and how it is just an absolute attraction. For Abu Dhabi in general. And now I want to get in kind of to the nitty-gritty. I'm going to talk about some really specific things that you can do while you're visiting the city. And again, these are much broader. But I just, when I was looking, just found some really interesting ideas. And so one of the first things that I looked at, because I know that I do not speak the language in the UAE, I do not have any sort of familiarity with a lot of the culture, a lot of the way that, day-to-day money works, things like that, because it is so foreign to me. I immediately wanted to go to some notable websites to look into specific tours that I can do, specific activities that I can do, and I've mentioned this in a lot of different planning episodes before, but if you can kind of get just at least, one pre-planned activity a day that is during your trips, that is really going to allow you just some extra comfort and ease and kind of planning things, on your laptop in your own country before you go can be really helpful. And so the first thing that I did was hopped on TripAdvisor, and I just looked at kind of the best things to do in Abu Dhabi, and I found one under the adventure category, which seems absolutely incredible. Pretty fair price, in my opinion, and something that I know I would really want to do, and I thought this was something that a lot of different people could experience. And so, as we know, the UAE is home to the desert, and so although the desert can be really overwhelming and kind of daunting, it also has a lot of adventure and outdoor recreation opportunities. And so I found this 7-hour desert safari it has a barbecue in it, a camel ride, and then sandboarding. And if you're not familiar with sandboarding, it is essentially similar to snowboarding, where you are hooked onto one board and you can actually kind of surf down, snowboarding or surfing, where you can kind of surf down these massive sand dunes. And so if you're into adventure, that would be something amazing to do. Or if you just want to go out and see the desert, they essentially have these cars that will pick you up from your hotel, from your Airbnb, from wherever you're staying. They will pick you up and they will literally drive you straight into the desert. And you can watch, like this specific one, watch traditional dance shows, get the chance to ride a camel, and enjoy the open buffet barbecue feast. And again, this is, a 7-hour trip, and so it is priced at $72 per person. However, if you consider the fact that you're getting a meal paid for and that you're going to be gone all day, that's, not a too poor price. And it says, following from your pickup from a hotel, the port or airport in Abu Dhabi, journey by air-conditioned 4WD Land Cruiser to the desert, just 45 minutes from the city center. Take a ride across the sands on a dune bashing adventure, experiencing what it is like to surf on sand with a sandboarding activity, a visit to a camel farm, watch the sunset, and then go traditional camp where you get coffee and dates, ride on the back of a camel, and await entertainments such as, let's see, what are some of the things that you can do? Henna painting, pipe smoking, posing with a falcon in traditional costume, feast from a buffet dinner, so on and so forth. And so, there are so many options to do in something like this. And if you are, less comfortable going out into the city and kind of taking reins of your own, day, scheduling something like this through TripAdvisor, so it's, it has 929 reviews, it's very notable, and this is a great opportunity for you to go, get a piece of the culture. You're going to get to talk to people who actually live in Abu Dhabi who are going to run this, but it's very safe, it takes a long time, so on and so forth, and it's an amazing adventure. I would want to do that so badly. So that's for something adventurous that you can do. I can't talk about Abu Dhabi without talking about shopping. So, Abu Dhabi and the UAE in general, because of its wealth, is extremely known for its amazing shoppings. The largest mall in the world, which I actually can't even fathom, is the Dubai Mall, and that's actually less than 100 miles from Abu Dhabi. And so if you feel like none of these malls are enough for you, you could also go there. But while you are in Abu Dhabi, I'd say you have to go shopping, even if you're not necessarily into that. It is actually an experience. And so I took to Forbes magazine for this to help me understand kind of the difference between the malls and what is going on with the malls. And so this is a quote from Forbes magazine. It says, "There may be no nation in the world that treats shopping the way that the UAE does. Malls serve every purpose, from a meeting point between friends and colleagues to a refuge form to the hot desert sun. And when you are in the insides of the shopping complexes, you know why locals and visitors alike keep coming back. And so here are the 5 top-rated malls. I'm going to give you brief overviews of all of them. To be honest with you, any of these malls, I'm sure, are absolutely will have what you are looking for. Some of the malls have, certain things that you might be interested in more or less, but here are the top 5. So there's the Galleria, which is a spacious modern mall in the Global Market Square, which, as I mentioned, that's where all the skyscrapers are. The Galleria is featuring shops, like luxury shops like Dolce & Gabbana, Jimmy Choo, Alexander McQueen, Michael Kors, and a range of other fashion and luxury goods, to suit even the pickiest shoppers, and an equally diverse set of dining options to boot. And this is, the Galleria is an absolutely gorgeous place in general, and so if you wanted to go more for the experience, this would be a good option for you. There's the Al Wadia Mall, which is number 4. It is, interestingly enough, named after the football club who plays at the stadium next door to the mall. And so if you wanted to, kind of hit 2 birds in one stone, you could do this and go see a game after. It's considered one of the city's most well-known landmark. The mall opened in 2007 and offers 150 retail brands, but it's evolved over the past decade, and it's one of the largest shopping complexes in the UAE, with a total footprint of 3.3 million square feet and over 350 stores now. So there used to be 150, now there's 350. And again, shops are anywhere from Armani to Exchange to The Gap to Victoria's Secret to Tommy Hilfiger, so you kind of have everything. Number 3 is the Marina Mall, that opened in 2001. It has 5 levels and 103 million square feet, 400 plus retail stores, which is, I can't even imagine. It has a bowling alley. It has a ton of restaurants. It has this one restaurant that is on top of a 30-story observation tower, and it has spectacular views of Abu Dhabi and the surrounding Persian Gulf area. So if you wanted to get more of a outdoor viewing experience, or you wanted to go bowling, you could go to the Marina Mall. And number 2 is the Abu Dhabi Mall, which is in the heart of the city. Has over 200 stores, fashion, labels, designers, anything you could think of. And it's directly connected to the Beach Renata Hotel, which is very popular. It is a centerpiece in the social fabric of the city. And so if you wanted a mall for convenience, this would be a great option for you. And then number 1 is the Yas Mall. So YAS Mall, located in the center of Yas Island. Yas Mall offers ultimate shopping, dining, and entertainment experiences in Abu Dhabi. It has 2.5 million square feet, 370 stores, includes all well-known brands you could think of. And it actually has over 60 restaurants and cafes to choose from. So you have, endless options of food to eat from all different places worldwide. And, I mean, it's supposed to be this, ultra-modern, very futuristic mall to go to. And that's the number 1 mall to go to in the UAE. And so the reason why I spent all this time to go through is because I really do think that you have to go to the mall just to experience what it is like to, have that so much at your fingertips almost. And this is also a great place if you don't know where to go to eat. Obviously, all of these places have lots of restaurants to go to. So, moving on to specifically art and culture in Dubai, and we are going to move on to that right after the break, so hang tight.
Always on the go, but the day just won't be one without your Hollywood fix. Let Golden State Media Concepts Entertainment Podcast take care of that. Jordan and Keith is Entertainment Tonight meets Access Hollywood.
I'm Jordan. The guy laughing, that's Keith.
Yeah, I'm Keith.
An all-inclusive look of pop culture.
And we are back from our break, just in time to talk about 2 very important parts of experiencing Abu Abu Dhabi's, just experiencing Abu Dhabi in general, and that is art and culture. And I strongly believe that you should see art in any place that you travel to, and it's not hard to do because art is almost everywhere in the world, to be honest with you. And I just think that there's so much to be said about what I don't know what different types of art and what different types of how art is displayed and the ways in which we see art in a city and so on and so forth, and how it can vary from state to state, from country to country, from continent to continent. And so I just want to talk specifically about a few different options that you have if you want to specifically experience art in a museum or in an exhibit or anything like that. And so I talked about these two islands that are in Abu Dhabi, and one of them is called the Saadiyat Island, which means Happiness Island, and it is a site that is actually home to New York University has an outpost there, and it is an arts center, but it is a series of planned cultural buildings, and a lot of architects kind of helped to create this island and to create this part of Abu Dhabi, and that is specifically to value the art, and that is where the Louvre of Abu Dhabi lives, and so it really is raising kind of a profile of this world-class destination for culture and art, for luxury shopping, fine dining, as we, talked about, and so kind of when the Louvre Museum of Art was created, it really sparked a new movement towards art, which I think is really amazing. And so since then, a lot of different art galleries have popped up all around the museum. And so inside, some of these galleries have, inside the Louvre, these, there's some of the same galleries, there's different rotating ones, changing temporary shows, all that have this global scape ranging from ancient to modern, which kind of goes with this theme that we've been talking about the whole episode. And something that I think is really interesting is it has a lot of different Eastern and Western influences together, which I think is so fascinating. And then something else to know about the art is, like I said, the architecture, and kind of looking in the mosques and all the art that all of the mosques have is kind of some of the best art that you can find in Abu Dhabi, which I think is really interesting. Okay, so moving on to culture. The UAE culture, which again, we always have to talk about culture when we talk about different places, because as I mentioned, you kind of have to know the culture when you're walking through its doors. I think it's absolutely crucial. And so the UAE culture mainly revolves around the religion of Islam, as we know, because Islam is a religion, but it's also kind of tied with traditional Arab culture. And so with the influences of Islamic and Arab culture, we see that in the architecture, in the music, and the clothing, and the cuisine, and the lifestyle. And that is all very prominent. And so this is something I want to read straight from a website called visitabudabi.com. And this is them explaining the culture and the lifestyle and how it affects us as tourists and us as Westerners. So they say the combination of international influences and a strong commitment to local heritage has created an intriguing mix of the new and the old in Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi's culture is firmly rooted in Arabia's Islamic traditions. Islam is more than a religion. It is a way of life that governs everyday events, from what to wear to what to eat and drink. The UAE's culture and heritage is inextricably linked to its religion, and it is a shining example of Islam's true commitment to tolerance and hospitality. Foreigners are free to practice their own religions, and the dress code is liberal. Women are able to drive and walk around unescorted. Among the most highly prized virtues are courtesy and hospitality, and visitors are sure to be charmed by the genuine friendliness of the people. Despite the speed of economic development over the last 30 years, Abu Dhabi continues to promote traditional culture and sporting events such as falconry, camel racing, and traditional dhow sailing. The traditional dress in the UAE, usually UAE nationals will wear traditional dress in public, and for men, this is a kandura, which is a white full-length shirt-like garment, which is worn with white or red checkered headdress, known as a gutra. This is secured with a black cord, and this is something I think if you can kind of picture this, and this is something I've seen a lot, especially through my travels. Different businessmen will wear certain different things. In public, a lot of women will wear long, loose black robes that cover their normal clothes, and then also a headscarf. And the headscarf is often sheer, flowing fabric with really intricate embroidery and beadwork along the wrists and the hemline. And these are also becoming much more elaborate as a statement of individuality, particularly among the young. Headwear varies, with some women wearing a thin black veil over their faces and other, generally older women, wearing a leather veil, which is called the burqa, which covers their nose, brows, cheekbones, and lips. And again, this really does vary, especially when you're in a city. You're going to see a lot of different fashion, a lot of different traditions, and I think that is, a really important thing to know going into visiting a place, and something that, again, I've been saying it for a few episodes now, that I really want to have a segment on entirely, is the idea of egocentrism or ethnic centrism, which is assuming that the way that you are and the way that your culture is kind of what's right, and when anyone else is doing something that doesn't represent your culture, they're wrong, or we associate being different with kind of being bad. And I think that this is a perfect example of, the way that people dress in a different area of the world doesn't mean that their women are oppressed, or that what they're doing is wrong, or anything like that. It really is just a way of dressing and a culture, and tied to a religion, which, I know I never want to restrict, and, the way that we dress might seem strange to people from different areas of the world, and I think kind of keeping that in mind, and as I mentioned in a few episodes, understanding that you are a visitor of a country, and if you decide to go to a place like the UAE or anywhere in the world, you have to understand that you are stepping into their country. They're not stepping into yours. And so those are important things to keep in mind. But as that article mentioned, it really doesn't matter what you dress. They're pretty liberal, especially because it's a city. I think a lot of times the Middle East gets a bad rap for the oppression of women, and like women not being able to drive or be walk around unescorted, but that is not the case here, which is great. We know that is the case in some places in the Middle East, and so those are also important things to note. Also, something important to note is that in terms of photography, which also is something I haven't talked too much on this podcast, and that I would like to do a whole segment on. I think I might do a whole podcast on cultural sensitivity in different countries, and that would be photography and ethnocentrism and egocentrism. And if you'd be interested in that, please let me know on any of our social media platforms. That would be very helpful. But photography, specifically in Abu Dhabi, because there are so many tourists, photography is acceptable. It is polite, however, to ask permission before taking photos of people, particularly women, because we know just culturally that is much more appropriate. Also to keep in mind, photographs of government buildings, military installations, and ports and airports should not be taken. Also, you might see this when you travel. Cameras may be banned in public areas designated for women and children only. And that is just a matter of protection and safety and so on and so forth. And so that's something really important to keep in mind. And just, again, as we are entering into places that have so much... might have so many different, cultural, or what we perceive as different cultural standpoints in us and cultural values, it is so important to, more than, going to Paris or Europe, even though you should, be doing that there, really doing your research and making sure that you are not hurting anyone else by you being in a certain area. And something like looking up policies of photography. I know, for example, I didn't know this at all, but in Nepal, it is really rude to take pictures of people in general, especially if you don't ask their permission, and it is extremely unacceptable to take pictures of children. And so this is something that is really important, because you can, I mean, it's not even for you, like, you could get yourself into trouble, but it's also, like, you wouldn't want a visitor in your country coming in and doing something that is really unacceptable or inappropriate to you. Like, for example, actually, just last week I watched this video about cultural norms, and it's actually really fascinating. In some parts of Asia, and I can't remember where, I don't know if it's China or Japan, which I will have to look into, it is, in some parts, it is culturally appropriate to, when you're on public transportation, like the train, or the subway, to lean over and, like, fall asleep on the person's head or shoulder next to you, which is so fascinating, because if you didn't know that, you'd be very confused. And if you live in a city, like I used to live in Boston, if anyone ever did that to me in Boston while I was sitting on the T, it would not be acceptable, but it is in some places. And so, making sure you know what the cultural norms are before going to a place, especially a place that is very far from what you are used to, is very important. After the break, we are going to discuss something that I don't talk nearly enough about, which is food, and then we are going to end our episode really quick with just discussing a few different things that are going on in the Middle East right now that would be relevant to you if you were traveling to the UAE, so stay tuned for that, and that is going to happen right after the break.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
And we are back from our break just in time to walk all the way through talking about a huge topic, which I will attempt to squeeze into a very small window, which is food and cuisine in Abu Dhabi. And I felt like I had to do this because I think the cuisine is so different, and I'm sure that there are a lot of foods that I have not tried, and that a lot of people who currently reside and grew up in the U.S. also have not tried. You will also hear me during this absolutely struggle over a lot of these names, very foreign to me, and so you'll have to apologize if I do not get the words quite right, but cuisine is really big in Abu Dhabi. As I mentioned, there are a lot of different cultures. There are a lot of different ethnicities that bring in a lot of different food, which is really interesting. And then, of course, because it's position, just in general, and what is, found around that area is going to kind of bring in different foods than what we are used to, and I think that that's really special. And so I'm just going to dive right into some dishes to try and some things to expect when you're traveling there. So there are a few things to start off with that, we might be more familiar with. We probably are familiar with falafel, which is essentially a substitute for French fries in the Middle East, which I thought was really interesting. If you don't know what falafel is, they're fried patties made up of ground chickpeas, and they can be served spicy or sweet with a dip in them, and they're just super popular in this area. They're pretty popular in the U.S. nowadays as well. And another one that you might be familiar with is tabbouleh, which is essentially like a spread or a dip. It's made up of green onions, tomatoes, cucumbers, parsley, crushed wheat, lemon juice, and fresh mint. It is so delicious. It's It's usually an appetizer, but it can totally be a full meal, and that's just something great. If you're a vegetarian, this is an amazing option for you to have while you're there. I was a vegetarian for 10 years, and I had such a hard time in different countries eating vegetarian just due to, a lot of, we're very spoiled in the U.S. in terms of being able to have vegetarian options, and I actually, this is something I'd love to talk about more in the future, but I actually stopped being a vegetarian for traveling reasons. That being, I felt an inability to experience culture and to be polite and to be able to try new things and accept food that's put on my plate if I was still a vegetarian. And so that is why I stopped. But if you are a vegetarian, both falafel and tabbouleh are really great options for you. You absolutely have to try them. Moving into a meal that is very interesting to me. Stuffed camel. This dish is considered the largest dish on the menu by the Guinness Book of World Records, which is really interesting. And it's essentially camel, which, as you might know, is a very popular animal in the Middle East. And it's stuffed with a lamb, which is stuffed with one or more chicken, which is stuffed with rice and eggs, and at times fish, which is very interesting. I don't know how I would feel about that, but it's only served on special occasions, but I think that if you are visiting, it would be a really great thing for you to try. Moving on to another really classical dish called al-hariz, which is, as I mentioned, one of the most traditional dishes you can get in the UAE, and it is supposed to be specially cooked during the month of Ramadan, or eat at Fitr, at weddings, during other special occasions, and it basically is made up of wheat and whatever meat of choice, usually chicken or lamb, and it's kind of like a big... it's almost like not a stew, but like a very thick soup, and it's boiled with butter and thick, and it has like a porridge consistency, basically. And so that is another really traditional meal that I had never heard of. I thought that was really interesting. There's tharid, which kind of looks like, if I'm looking at a picture right now, it almost looks like ramen, or, something you'd get at like a Vietnamese restaurant, but it's essentially a soupy stew made up of chicken, lamb, or mutton, and vegetables, and it has broth in it, and it usually has hard-boiled eggs, so on and so forth. Okay, and then moving on to a dessert, lastly, of course. I am such a fan of dessert. It gets me in a lot of trouble, makes me spend a lot of money, but I always like trying different desserts in different areas, and so this might be a dessert that you would like to try. And it's called liquamat, which again, I am definitely butchering 100%, but it is the most popular dessert in the UAE, and they're basically crunchy dumplings soaked in sweet and sticky date syrup. Oh, that sounds so good to me. And it's a great way to kind of end your dish, and it's something that you should definitely try if you get an opportunity to. Okay, those were just a few dishes. Please always try cuisine and just go, I think traveling in general is such a great time to run outside of your comfort zone, and if you are uncomfortable with that, a great way to, kind of push yourself and do more is through cuisine and through trying different things and experiencing different things. And if you think about it, although I think art is invaluable, I think culture is invaluable, I think all of these things are invaluable, eating food from a country or a city that you've never been to truly is a unique opportunity. I mean, we simply just don't have resources that other places do. And so, trying food to me is kind of like a, once in a lifetime opportunity. If you're only going to visit this country once, or this place once, or this city once, I'm going to want to try the food, because that to me is like one of the most unique experiences to have. And so definitely go outside of your comfort zone the next time you travel. If you want to go to Abu Dhabi, these are some meals that you can try both in your comfort zone and outside of your comfort zone. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I'm going to talk briefly about the political climate in the Middle East. Stay tuned.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
And we are back for our very last segment, which I will be talking about some issues that are happening in the Middle East right now. But just to wrap up our full episode, we talked all about the AUE and Abu Dhabi. We talked about the basics of the city. We talked about the architecture, the art, the fashion, the shopping, different cultural norms. We talked about cuisine. And lastly, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk briefly about the relationship between the UAE and the US. And then, of course, because you would be traveling to the Middle East, I just want to really briefly talk about some issues going on in the Middle East as a whole, which is that is just a massive blanket statement. The Middle East is a massive place. But before I talk about anything, I think it's really important for me to clarify a point and to kind of get something straight, which is that I'm not an expert. It's not right for me to try to explain exactly what's happening or for anyone to take my word as fact. And so my biggest piece of advice is something that I've learned through different travel studies that I've done, different research that I've done, is that you really do need to look at your sources, and you, meaning me and everyone, and literally if everyone just looked at where their news was coming from and who was saying what and why they were saying that, I think we'd have a lot less discourse happening. And so, as I mentioned, I am not an expert. It's something I'm really fascinated in, but I certainly am not an expert in it. And so, kind of instead of like spewing my own opinion at you, I think I'm just going to provide you with a few resources so that you can decide for yourself. But before I really get to that, one thing I'd like to take away, and then I promise I will not be political on this podcast anymore, is that my biggest takeaway from studying Islam in the Middle East, as I mentioned, that's part of what I studied in school, from a purely academic standpoint, is that the news and many politicians in the U.S. and around the world have villainized Muslims in the Middle East an extreme amount and more than it deserves. And so, without obviously getting into that too much, it's just important that we look at our own impact, and we look at why the Middle East and the U.S. are having problems and why we have decided to put so much prejudice and put so much of our own opinions on Muslims and American Muslims and Middle Eastern Muslims. And that is just a loaded statement, but I think it's really important to step back and ask yourself why you think the things that you think. What is your association with the Middle East? What do you think when you first think of the Middle East, and why do you think that? And how much of it has to do with your actual opinions and facts that you have learned, and how much it has to do with what the media has conveyed to you. And so, okay, I promise not as political as I will get on this podcast. Now, as I mentioned, I'm just going to give you some important sources to consider, and maybe a few that can help you. And the first that I'm going to talk about is from the U.S. Department of State, and this is saying what the relations are between the U.S. and the United Arab Emirates. And so I'm literally just going to read you this straight from the website. They say the United States has had a friendly relations with the UAE since 1971 following its formation and independence from the United Kingdom. The two countries established formal diplomatic relations in 1972. The UAE plays an influential role in the Middle East and is a key partner for the United States. The United States and the UAE enjoy strong bilateral cooperation on a full range of issues, including defense, non-proliferation, trade, law enforcement, energy policy, and cultural exchange. The two countries work together to promote peace and security, support economic growth, and improve educational opportunities in the region all around the world. And so that's important information, obviously, for you to know to the UAE. It is a perfectly safe place to travel. There should be no problems. The U.S. and the UAE have a great relationship, and the U.S. actually provides support for the UAE in terms of export, border security, and that's all assistance to the UAE. So that's kind of an additional thing to consider, that the country that you're traveling to in the U.S. have really great relationships because of, obviously, worst case scenario, anything happened, you know that you will be fine. So that is the UAE. The UAE has a good relationship with the U.S. It has generally fair treatment of people, and that is a broad statement, and again, don't quote me on that, but it is a pretty safe and safe place to travel to. It's economically developed, and it has a great relationship with the U.S. So moving on as quickly as I can, I am just also going to touch on a Washington Post article that I read, which is essentially predicting what is going to happen in 2020 in terms of the Middle East. And I just want to read a short excerpt from that and then talk a little bit about what the article is saying. So the article, and again, this is the Washington Post, says it does not take a crystal ball to see that 2020 will be tumultuous with the Middle East. Libya's civil war has taken a dangerous turn, with Russian mercenaries and Turkish forces joining the fray as General Haftar forces push into the capital. Yemen is still ravaged by economic blockade and war, despite recent efforts on all sides to de-escalate the conflict. Syria's civil war continues to be a problem, with a massive new wave of refugees fleeing violence. Large-scale popular protests are challenging Iraq's government, which is bracing for fallout from the growing confrontation between the U.S. and Iran. Israel and the Palestinian territories could dramatically change their relationship as the prospects of the two-state solution dissolve. And the protest movements throughout the region could shake up to half a dozen regimes. And so that is a loaded paragraph, but that is just explaining some of the issues that are happening in the Middle East right now. And then this post talks about 3 trends to watch in the Middle East for the upcoming year, and those 3 are number 1 being every government is on edge about the U.S. 2020 election. Number 2 is conflicts in the Persian Gulf region are getting harder to control, and again, that is excluding the UAE, but that is the Persian Gulf region in general. And then number 3 is that protests just continue to happen. We are all familiar with the Arab Spring. That was in 2011. And since then, protests have just continued to grow, which is, good and bad relatively. So to conclude, those are some, things to know about the Middle East that you're traveling to. Most important thing to know that the UAE is safe. The United States has a good relationship with them, so on and so forth. And that is going to wrap up our show today. Please remember to you can like us on Facebook, you can follow us on Twitter. If you could leave a rating and a review, that always helps us out so much. As always, thank you so much. Have a good and safe night, and we will see you on the next podcast.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From travel to health and wellness to entertainment and life and happiness to sex and relationships. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast.